Okay, friends, welcome to part 4 of our presentation on managing data resource. In this presentation, we'll talk about high-level approach to data management. And I told you before that sometimes all those approaches, processes, and techniques, also technologies and methods, they're included under one umbrella of data governance. Now, data management process typically involves the following smaller processes related to planning, sourcing, acquiring, and maintaining data. And all those processes are listed here, and we'll talk about each of these processes in a bit more detail. Well, first of all, planning. You need to develop a blueprint for data and the relationship among data across business units and functions. Now, we talked about enterprise modeling approach, and we said that often this approach is unrealistic. Nobody is smart enough. Nobody has the kind of resources, analytical capacity, and foresight to even approximate data needs for the entire organization, especially if future developments are taken into account. However, this idea that enterprise data modeling is losing momentum does not mean that data should be left to chaos. I mean, of course, even if it's a conductive approach, if you start planning your data models from ground up, there still needs to be some kind of planning. Some sort of planning for the future data needs, planning when it comes to creating the model itself. So planning cannot be avoided. Source. Identify the timeliest and highest quality source for each data element. For any kind of piece of data that you need, there may be several sources, so your job to identify the most reliable data source, let's say about customers. Acquire and maintain. Once you identify sources, you need to build a system that captures data to acquire and maintain data for further organizational need. Also, you need to constantly define and describe inventory of data. That's some other terms for that is maintaining data dictionary or maintaining metadata. You need to make sure that every data attribute, every entity is properly recorded so that somebody else can understand what's happening in your data repository. Also, your job is to organize and make data accessible, meaning designing databases so that data can be retrieved and reported efficiently in the format that business managers require and can understand. So organizing and making data accessible is very important because, at the end of the day, if the data is not accessed, it's not being used by managers or employees, it means that it's not generating any value for the organization. Now, one popular technical method to make data accessible is to create something called data warehouse. Now, data warehouse can be viewed as a huge collection of data marts or databases, from specific functional units. But collectively, that centralized storage of organizational data is called a data warehouse. Now, this is how the architecture for a data warehouse looks like. Legacy application system, meaning old systems, and new application systems, they're combined together to create operational store, like this pre-processed data storage. This data is cleaned, let's say errors are corrected, missing values are removed, and then transformed into usable form. And once this data is transformed into usable form, sometimes people call that form information, it's stored in the data warehouse. And then if there is a need by a specific department for a specific application or analysis tool or reporting tool, this data is combined or borrowed from the centralized location for this specific application. However, the location remains intact, and data is always stored here in a centralized place. And then different applications, they're just creating data marts, like basically subsets of the data to provide whatever functionality those applications they need to produce. And then there's a feedback loop because actions from decisions, they impact the data that is coming in. So this is how a typical architecture of a data warehouse looks like. Controlling quality and integrity is an important aspect of data management, protecting and securing it to make sure there's no unauthorized access, to make sure the data is not leaked. Account for use, here we're talking about this economic perspective because you always, data is not free. You always need to keep track of how much it costs to capture, maintain, and report data. You also need to bill appropriate departments, for the usage of data. So basically, it means like data needs to be properly accounted for from that accounting/economic standpoint. Recover, restore, and upgrade. You need to establish procedures for recovering damaged data. Upgrade obsolete hardware and database technologies to make sure that data, is properly stored and it's not lost. Determine retention and dispose, decide on legal and other grounds how much data history needs to be kept. Of course, in a way, storing the more data you store, the more beneficial it is for your organization. But sometimes, if you store too much data, things can get out of control, where your existing storage infrastructure cannot handle any additional data, and overall things become very complicated and confusing. So maybe you can make it a rule that after a certain amount of time, based on legal or some business considerations, all data is being discarded. That would make things cheaper and simpler for an average organization. Also, you need to train and consult for effective use. Again, if data is not used, it's useless, it's not generating any value for organization. Users need to know where to get data that will help them in their work, or at least they need to know where to turn to, who they should ask for help if they need a particular data set for their specific task. Now, when it comes to developing policy, policies is another aspect of data governance. Typically policies, they fall into two areas: data ownership and data administration. Data ownership means a set of policies that establish who owns data, what is the procedure for acquiring or borrowing data from another department, and data administration involves like how data is handled, how data is stored, how it's updated, what kind of quality assurance mechanisms apply to this data, and so forth. Again, those things are typically included under the umbrella of data governance. Now, a few comments about data ownership. Now, policies or issues related to data ownership, they deal with the question of who owns data. Now, defining those things, which department owns which data, is helpful when it comes to protecting customer privacy, protecting trade secrets of the organization, and so forth. But at the same time, those data ownership definitions, they shouldn't be strict to the point where it prevents data sharing and collaboration. At the same time, non-sensitive data, it needs to be shared freely across departments to improve collaboration and value creation for the entire organization. So some organizations choose to draft something called corporate information policy that outlines, data ownership, what is protected and what should be freely distributed. So here you have an example of an information policy. And, if you read it, the starting sentence is that data is a corporate resource. Much of our corporate data is stored electronically. Excellence in data management is key to achieving many of our business goals. The following statements constitute our electronic data access policy. Corporate data will be shared internally. Data are not owned by a particular individual or organization, but by the whole organization. So basically, it means that this particular paragraph within the corporate information policy makes sure that people are not protected. Units, departments are not secretive and protective of their own data. Because many functional units are secretive and protective of their data, because it's related to this saying that knowledge is power, information is power. Sometimes departments feel that if somebody else can have access to their data, that will diminish their legitimacy, their independence. So it's like an invasion on their turf. So that's why they will not share any kind of data if they don't have to. So this policy says you have to share data, because whatever data you have belongs to the organization, not to you personally. Nowadays, there are also a number of issues related to data storage and data administration related to trans-border data flow. A lot of organizations nowadays are those virtual network organizations. For example, a company can be headquartered somewhere, in California, let's say, and then it's registered in the state of California. However, let's say data is stored somewhere in Hong Kong because of more liberal, rules in relation to consumer data, or in relation to what kind of data can be stored. So this creates a number of issues, because if somebody has a problem with the company, let's say there's some kind of lawsuit, so the question becomes under which jurisdiction this company falls into. I mean, if the company, in a way the company is registered in California, so it's a US company, however data was being stored and, let's say, mishandled in Hong Kong. So in which jurisdiction, somebody needs to have this matter cleared, in California or in Hong Kong. And of course, there are like all kinds of issues related to different, different, I guess, legalities with respect to data. So it has to do with, privacy, piracy, international trade, protecting national trade secrets, and so forth. So I guess what I'm saying here with this slide overall is that if an organization storing data across geographical or political borders, it adds a lot of complexity to data management. Now, a few final comments before we wrap up. Nowadays, IT or information system unit is accountable for data management. So this is the organization that manages, this is the functional unit, the department that manages data within an organization. And one important post within the information system function is the so-called database administrator, or DBA. So it's a nice position with responsibility for managing an organization's electronic databases. Now, DBAs are typically highly paid professionals because being a DBA requires, good, deep knowledge from a number of fields. First of all, IT in general, more specifically, database management systems, database technologies, ERD modeling, and any kind of DBA needs to have a knowledge, domain knowledge. In other words, you cannot be a DBA for an investment company without understanding finance, the key entities and attributes of those entities that are used by investment banks, because otherwise you won't be able to, to talk to end users, such as brokers and stock analysts, and you won't be able to make sure that all of their data requirements are met. So that's why DBAs are typically very highly paid professionals, because they need to have good knowledge in several areas. Okay, friends, so that concludes part 4 of our chapter 4 presentation on managing data as a resource. Thank you for listening.